Recently, I was invited to debate a Libertarian fellow by the name of the Southern Avenger. I want to show you a brief clip from that debate, if I may.
You know, you got Ron Paul, his boy that he's made at least, I don't know, 20% of his videos about, who is essentially a guy that has stood up for states' rights. It's like a George Wallace type, like we have the right to discriminate.
Yeah, you know that me comparing Ron Paul to George Wallace was ridiculous because the Southern Avenger laughed at it. You know, you see him like, ha ha, oh, you. Oh, that is rich.
George Wallace type, like we have the right to discriminate.
Hey guys, I have an idea. You know, just for a lark, just for shits and fucking giggles, let's watch an old clip of George Wallace. You know, that Alabama governor during the civil rights era who was the major proponent of segregation and institutionalized racism. Let's just watch a clip of him justifying why it's okay for his state to have segregation. That might be fun. Let's just watch that, because, you know, it's obviously stupid for me to compare him to Ron Paul, but let's just see what he's got to say, you know?
We are defending the right of the people of Virginia and of Alabama to decide some questions for themselves. And if you folks who have had some liberals to tell you about the Constitution, let me suggest that you go to your library and you read the debates in the Constitutional Convention of the state of Virginia, and you read the debates in the Constitutional Convention of the state of New York and of New Hampshire and of the original 13 states, and you will find that not a single one of the states wanted to come into the Union until first they were guaranteed that we were going to have a government of limited powers, that all powers not delegated to the government expressly would be lodged and kept with the people of Virginia and of New York and of New Jersey.
That was interesting. It was interesting the way that George Wallace, major proponent of segregation and institutionalized racial discrimination on a state level, was using the states' rights argument to support what he was doing. You know, that's kind of interesting how he did that. You know, Ron Paul's never done anything like that, except for the time he did. There clearly is no right to privacy nor sodomy found anywhere in the Constitution. There are, however, states' rights. Rights plainly affirmed by the 9th and 10th Amendments. Under those amendments, the state of Texas has the right to decide for itself how to regulate social matters like sex, using its own local standards. But rather than applying the real Constitution and declining jurisdiction over a properly state matter, the court decided to apply the imaginary Constitution and impose its vision on the people of Texas. So, Ron Paul uses the states' rights argument to argue that Texas has the right to regulate the sex lives of its citizens, and then George Wallace uses the states' rights argument to argue that the state has the right to discriminate against black people. Does anyone else detect something of a pattern here? You know, a lot of times when people point out that Ron Paul has huge support amongst white nationalists, the response of the Paul-tards is usually something like, whoa, whoa, yeah, that may be true. He does have a lot of support there. We can't deny it. He does accept donations from white supremacist groups. You shouldn't pay attention to that because Ron Paul himself is not a racist. So, if Ron Paul's not a racist, and I'll grant that, I could point to evidence that Ron Paul is a racist. There was racist stuff published in Ron Paul's newsletters, which he used to defend, but now claims he had nothing to do with. But I'll ignore that. I will grant you that Ron Paul is not a racist. He views all men, no matter what their skin color, as equals. That's Ron Paul. Great guy. But he still stands for states' rights, which means he still stands for the right of the state to discriminate, as is evidenced by his comments regarding Texas. So anyone out there seeking an answer for why a bunch of white supremacists support a guy who claims not to be racist, the reason is because they have a tradition of states' rights advocacy, just like Ron Paul does. Because they remember when good old George Wallace said that the state had the right to discriminate, and now they hear the same exact rhetoric from Ron Paul. What these state power, state authority motherfuckers are really trying to tell us is that states deserve the right to discriminate against us. Well, you know what? Even if you're an individual, discriminating against other people is not your fucking right. And it certainly isn't the right of a state government to make policies that discriminate against other people. I am the Amazing Atheist, and I don't believe in states' rights. I believe in individual rights. I believe that you are the owner of yourself and you have the right to self-determination as long as you are not in violation of the consent clause. In other words, you do not have the right to do something to someone else against their consent. Failing that, fucking have at it. You can do whatever you want. Peace the fuck out.